This past week, or I should say the week before that, it just seems like one long day vacation Bible school took place, and I was inspired. I know a few of you were inspired. I know many who have contacted me through other means saw just clips from Vacation Bible School. They were inspired. One of the verses, the foundational passages for our time together, was Esther 4. Now, when I think of this story of Esther, many things pop into my mind, but the phrase taking a stand can be dangerous seem to rise to the top. Taking a stand can be dangerous. Some of my friends on the internet, whether it's through Facebook or through Twitter or others, have said when they hear passages like Esther, they say, oh, preachers getting political again, getting political. They're just talking about politics. They're not talking about the Bible or God. But when we truly drill down to the core of what it could be and what it could mean to be people of faith, to live into our faith, Esther has prophetic words for us. But most of all, she provides an example for us, for those who live in somewhat protected environments, for persons who know that they're going to have employment, but may not know where it is, but know that we're going to have it, like myself as an elder in the United Methodist Church with guaranteed appointment. What does it mean to put one's position, standing, one's very life on the chopping block when you stand up for what God calls you to stand up for? During this recent week, I would say, Esther began and continued to grow inside of me. Her example is a witness of how we should be able to deal with our fears and grapple with our struggles and face our prejudices and move with courage in the midst of the world we live in. So we too are invited to embrace this same spirit that Esther exemplified for us. This spirit of boldness. God's spirit will empower us to go beyond, as the kids said this past week. God's spirit will empower us to go beyond our confines and what we seem to think are our limitations. When I looked at the history behind this passage, I like history, and some people know that. That was my major in college, but a map popped up, and I looked at that map of when the Israelites were first taken away, when Israel disintegrated and was conquered by Babylon, and the Jews were taken into captivity, many of whom, the most prominent of whom, those who had skills, artisans, and other types of people who could add to a community's value, all of those persons were taken away from the Holy Land. They traveled, as you can see at some point when you look at a map of the region of that time period, they traveled thousands of miles from Jerusalem into what we might call is modern day Iran, to the city of Susa, as some biblical scholars have talked about, not far from what we would call the Persian Gulf now. They were scattered in the towns and the cities throughout that area. Some call that the Jewish diaspora, the dispersion of God's holy people. But they did not wither and die. Yes, they struggled. Yes, they had to learn new ways, new languages, new cultures, but many of them maintained the core of who they were. One such person we hear about was Mordecai, Esther's elder cousin, or some say uncle, the one who had adopted her when her parents had both passed, the one who cared for her and protected her and taught her, the one who gave her that opportunity to be chosen by King Xerxes to be his queen. Yes, Esther pops on the scene for us as a role model of not just her own being, but the example of what perseverance and what one can do in the midst of adversity. Not just the individual, but the community's adversity. And so I think about those travels and how that journey led to the passage that we're unpacking right now. Some have even said, why do we even read the book of Esther? It never mentions the word God directly. And then others say, but it challenges us to look beneath the words. It inspires us to read between the lines and to see God's activities amongst God's people in times in which it might not have been popular. Well, we can go beyond that. We know that it was almost deadly to profess and to live one's faith. Mordecai, one who refused to bow to a human being, because at that point in time, the Jewish beliefs were that one only should bow to God, not to a human being or a representative claiming to be God. They did not argue, dispute, or fight with other cultures. They just said, this is who we are. And so Mordecai did not do that. He did not bow to Haman, the king's second in command. And as it is with our human ego, and yes, when we come from different backgrounds, we bring our own baggage, luggage, and beliefs and with us. And so Haman took great offense, we are told. He set his heart on getting even. I have found in my own personal life that whenever one sets your heart on getting even, nothing good ever occurs. It might appear that we win that battle today or tomorrow, but in the long run, only bad rises up. And so Haman has gotten the king, tricked the king, some have said, to decree that any that would pray to any but the king Xerxes would those Jewish folk. Now, king wasn't aware of what he was doing. He thought it sounded good that people should pray to him. Who amongst us don't like people giving us homage and paying homage to us, and especially one who saw himself as divine? And so he signed that decree. Yes, he did. Even though his queen, Esther, was from that group of persons, or a group would be the most affected by it, the most traumatized by it, the most attacked by it. When the word of this decree got out, we're told that Mordecai sent word to Esther, and Esther in her protected position, some say in her ivory tower, some remind us in the court of the king's court, you lived an extravagant life, you lived a comfortable life. She did not want to her position. She did not want to put in danger her very life. That's not unusual amongst us human beings, but when God calls us to take a stand, it can sometimes be dangerous. I believe that verses 12 and 13 expose the power that fear can have in these contexts when we don't move with courage, when we allow fear to overcome us and to envelop us and to inhibit us and to stop us from stepping out on faith, stepping out with courage, being bold for God's ways. We can allow fear to overcome us. Esther was no different, we are told, and so she sent word back to Mordecai after he said, you know, what's going on here? I'm going to paraphrase it for you in Brad Watkins style, that you know what's going on here, that we are being persecuted, that we will be exterminated. And she says, you know, feeling for you, brother, but I can't help you now. Y'all be all right over there in the corner, you know, in the Jewish community. Somebody will do something. And Mordecai sent a rebuttal back to her. And he said, yes, you may feel safe in that place that you reside in the position that you hold, but make no mistake about it, you and your family will suffer if you do not speak out, if you do not figure out a way to get to the king. But in the end, somehow, some way, God will save the Jewish people. God will rise up or raise up, if you would, some force of righteousness and justice. Somewhere along the line, we in our culture here have separated God's righteousness and God's justice and God's love from being bold for God. Somewhere along the line, some have said what it means to be spiritual, holy, and sanctified is to never speak on situations and to never place one in positions of danger or threat to one's comfort or one's way of existence. But Mordecai reminds us that God calls us, just as God called Esther, out of our comfort zones, out of what we perceived as our limited spaces, to step into what some might think is an abyss of unknowns. But in the unknown, that's when God rises up. Through the unknown, that's when marvelous things can take place for God's people. And so Esther, being convicted by her relatives' words, and I'd like to think by God's Spirit, sends word back that yes, I'm going to do something, but you know, I'm going to need to fast and pray. 3 days fasting and praying. And as I'm praying and fasting, I need the rest of y'all to do the same. I need the whole Jewish community to join me in that. Because with my own power, I can't do anything. But with God's power, who knows? And so the story moves on, and it reminds us that we are called to move outside of fear. Those 3 words some might sum up this passage were fear, prejudice, and courage. The prejudice that Haman exhibited, unfortunately, is not relegated to the pages of history and biblical narratives. It continues to exist in our culture today. It continues to predominate and seep through even some of our spiritual and faith teachings. We have to rise above that. We have to call it out when we see it. We have to not be afraid to stand face to face and toe to toe with prejudice and say, I will not give in, even if I exist in a position of privilege. As I continue to process this passage, I couldn't help but wonder, what would Esther's example say to us in the face of the continued mass shootings in the U.S.? Would Esther call us to say something, to do something? Would Esther call us to not just live in fear? I heard on a morning newscast that the sale of bulletproof backpacks for children to go to school had risen 200% since last week. 200%. If there ever was a spirit of fear, that is it. Does God call us to say or do something other than accept the status quo? This status quo cannot stand. It would be easy to look over that and to say, that's just political. God has got to be weeping with the families, not only of El Paso and Dayton, but families across our nation that are struggling with fear. Families right here in this community. God calls us to stand up. And it's dangerous sometimes because our friends may not agree with us. Our neighbors may say that has nothing to do with what it means to be one who follows God. But I believe Esther speaks out to us this morning. Esther's legacy calls us as those who have chosen, because we weren't born into Judaism, those who have chosen to be followers of Jesus and that one who was a descendant of the Jewish legacy and tradition. Esther calls us to stand up for those moments, those potential moments with possibility. Author Erwin McManus, in his book, Seizing Your Divine Moment, writes, "What if you knew somewhere in front of you was a moment that would change your life forever? A moment rich with potential, a moment filled with endless possibilities." I believe that those divine moments can be dangerous or life-changing. It is that moment or those moments which the witness of Esther calls us to seize, not for our benefit, but God's greater hope in this world for the voiceless and the powerless. I would invite our hymn leader back up at this time. When we stand for God, it can be dangerous. But to do nothing is always an option, but it's not God's option. I believe that as we read between the lines, God's voice speaks to us through Esther. What in our lives is calling us to speak out and stand up with boldness for God?